Welcome back to the Resisting Pretense podcast. We are having honest conversations about a life of faith in modern culture, and I hope by the end of this episode, like every episode, it'll sharpen your thinking and inspire faith-infused conversations.
Excellent.
And that's Scott's whole job. Scott's whole job is to just listen to what I say, respond with excellent, and then we just keep going.
Wished I would have thought of that.
Getting creative now. I like it. Today's episode is about prayer, and I'm really tempted to look at the camera, but it's an audio podcast that we're going to film for other reasons. So I'm going to try to remember not to look at the camera because that's my last look. Okay, bye. Today's episode is about prayer and maybe poking a little fun at some of the quirky things that we do in prayer, but also hopefully talking about things that, I don't know, maybe just don't get said a lot.
And maybe some misconceptions.
There you go. Excellent. Boy,
We got to rolls backwards.
We should be really good at this. Like, we really should be really good at prayer. Jesus said, you know, when he kind of infamously went into the temple and like, my house should be a house of prayer. I feel like it is central to our faith that we have this connection with God and we have the freedom to talk to him whenever we want and the assurance that he cares and he's listening and he responds. Like, that should be huge. And I still see a lot of Christians who struggle.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like it would be that hard. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me that a conversation with somebody you have a relationship would be that difficult. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that makes it? Why is it so difficult for Christians just to have a conversation?
Well, it's obviously, I mean, the obvious thing is you're talking to somebody you can't physically see, and you don't generally, unless you're some special kind of Christian, or maybe crazy, but you're not hearing that direct feedback, and so that lack of visual and auditory feedback, I think that makes it hard. It feels like a one-way conversation, not a two-way conversation, and that could be a little awkward.
Do you think that's part of a faith question, though? I mean, part of it is because no one's feeding back. I'm not sure they're really there.
That's a great question. I don't know that I necessarily think it's a faith problem. It's just it's the only place that we have a conversation like this, unless it's like with ourselves. But then we're doing the other half of the conversation when you're talking to yourself, kind of like, you know, you might say something out loud and think the response, but
or with my invisible friend. But my psychiatrist is dealing with that.
I think when it's private prayer, it's just an unusual thing. It takes time to get accustomed to it. And if you don't persist through the awkward phase, you don't get to the comfortable phase. I also think in the sphere of public prayer, you've got, then you've got a whole new list of insecurities, like comparing how I pray to how somebody else prays, and, you know, does my prayer sound as, you know, as interesting, or, you know,
or does it just sound stupid?
Yeah, does it just sound stupid? Does it sound confident? In that sense, I think it almost becomes very similar to the fear of public speaking that apparently somebody has said is the biggest fear in the world. I never actually, everybody quotes that, like that's the biggest fear. I've never seen the study, and it's probably exists, but that fear of being up and like tripping over your own words and being embarrassed by it, I'm sure there's some of that too. Why are you so afraid to pray, Scott?
I'm not, honestly, but I'm also comfortable with public speaking. But there's also a part of me that looks at it and says, like a conversation you and I are having, or if I'm in a conversation of a group of people, and we're just talking to somebody, my part of the prayer is just that part of the conversation.
Right, right.
And then when you pray, you're just taking over the conversation with the same center of attention. And so, and I can't tell you that, when I first became a Christian, I was afraid of praying. I was afraid of saying or not saying the right thing until somebody said to me, there is no right or wrong in prayer. It's just a conversation. And in that conversation, if there is something that you sense you've said wrong, that's probably between you and God, not the people around you.
Yeah. I don't I don't remember, and our faith experiences are, we've both been around faith for a long time. You kind of had an adult change-o of going from the Catholic Church, which was more ritual driven, to the Protestant Church, which is more kind of uh, extemporaneous in prayer. Is that a fair way to say it?
Okay,
Maybe
excellent.
not.
I think for me, um, and that might be a good way to put it. I think that for me, my growing up years, it was much more rote memorization, not
Hmm.
understanding the relationship. Um, after switching faiths, um, if you will, uh, I learned that it was a relationship. It was about
Yeah,
like talking to my father,
yeah,
um, and it switched up um, how I viewed prayer, which is interesting because if I go back and visit a Catholic church now,
yeah.
I'm amazed at the deep meaning and relationship of the prayer of whoever wrote it. But for most people, or for many people, I should say, I think they miss that relational piece to it.
That's a fascinating. Like, you can see the relational connection in the words, but not necessarily in the people who are engaging in, and at least not all of them. Um, I grew up in a faith tradition that was always, it was very relational, and so I don't remember having a hard time with this. But again, I'm a pastor. I'm comfortable public speaking. I'm comfortable in groups. And so, and faith is very, very, very central to, kind of my whole life experience. So anyhow, let's back up the truck and go just to pure fundamentals. What is prayer? You've already kind of let the cat out of the bag on that one. What's your simple answer to what is prayer?
My simple answer is it's a conversation. It is uh, whatever is going on in my life at that time, I can share with God. Everything from, I remember uh, a few months after my dad died, I was standing in my living room and I was in some ways literally yelling uh,
Really?
and just saying, God, I'm not mad at you, but I'm mad. And I need to do something with this anger. And to feel comfortable that I could go to my father and just kind of go, "Bleh," and know that he could
Is that a
take it.
technical term? Yeah.
That's a religious term.
Yeah.
Um, but know that he could take it. Know that he could. And then there's other times where I've just sat down quietly and said, I just want to be with you for a
Mm.
while. And so it was always just this desire to be in the presence and to have a conversation.
Yeah, I don't think there's a better definition to prayer than conversation. I think my struggle is I have a tendency to lean toward agenda of, like, wanting to, I've got an agenda in this prayer. I've got something I want to do, and so when you describe, just, hey, I just want to be with you. I just want to hang out. That's a challenging place for me to get to prayer, to get to in prayer, because often I come in like I'm praying for a reason, and then once I've completed that reason, then I'm
I'm out.
I'm done. Yeah, peace out, mic drop. Um,
We're done.
yeah, not these mics, and these are precious to me. Uh, but the prayer conversation, um, and we'll talk more about it later. But I've said for a long time that the one of the dangers of prayer is when it becomes like a vending machine, and that's a danger that I have to watch. That, um, you done? That danger of treating God like he's a vending machine, and so prayer then is just like getting correct change to get the response you want. That's a dangerous place to be. I think another dangerous place to be is when you think of prayer like it's magic.
Mm.
And I don't know that a lot of people would use those words, but they behave that way. Like if I say the right words the right way, then I've somehow obligated God to a response. And that to me is also dangerous because that's no longer a relationship. It's as if you're in control, and you it's a formula, and then you get your you pull the lever and your blessing comes out kind of.
Well, and I think in some ways that's where people would say, I prayed for healing and it didn't happen, so it must not be true.
Mm,
Well, that's that mindset of if I say the right words, if I conjure up the right emotion, if I have the right attitude, God will do what I say.
yeah.
In reality, it's saying, God, you have the power. Are you willing in this situation? And sometimes the answer is no. And
Ah,
so
it's
I
so
think
hard.
it is hard. Um,
I got an email said like literally on my way over here. I got an email from someone who is struggling with their faith, like not even sure that they have faith, questioning everything about it, primarily because they're in a marriage that's struggling. And and they I imagine, I haven't had a follow-up conversation yet with this person, but I imagine it's some of that same mentality, like I prayed for God to heal this relationship and it hasn't happened. So now what do I even think about God? And that's a hard place to be.
it is, and I think the older I get, the more I realize that there are things that God can do and can't do, and there's things God that won't do. And I have no biblical backup for it other than to say that at this point in my spiritual being, I don't believe God will interfere with free will. He can. He's capable. He's given the ability. I mean, he obviously has the ability, but my point being is that if I pray for my marriage to be healed and it's not healed, is it a question about God's will, or is it a question about the other person's will to exercise their free will?
Right, right.
And my role is to step in and say, God, here's where I am. I'm hurting, and my relationship is hurting, and I need you. I want you to heal this relationship. But sometimes we forget about that. How, God, what has to happen in me to be a part of that?
Right.
Not change that person, but what is my role? What have I need to change in me, or what do you need to change in me?
So
Even
good.
if that doesn't resolve itself.
Yeah, my theological radar went off when you said, you're talking about things God can or can't do, and I'm like, well, it's always can. He always can. But then you added the will or won't, and I think it's kind of like he can, but there's some things he won't do to violate our freedom to make our own choice. Yeah. Um. So that's the basis of prayer. That's the foundation. It's a conversation.
Can I add one more thing that when you talked about your struggle, where my struggle sometimes is,
Hmm.
and that is that I get into my list of things I pray every day.
Oh yeah.
And so I pray for my kids, I pray for my grandkids, I pray for protection, but sometimes I get so wrapped up in doing my checklist of prayer things instead of stopping and going, wait a minute, God, let me tell you what's really happening in my day today,
Yeah.
or here's what I'm sensing.
Yeah. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the list in and of itself. It just can lead us toward the vending machine concept if we're not careful to make sure that the list is just a reminder. The same way if like if you hadn't seen somebody in a long time and you're like, oh, I have these things I want to say to them, and so you kind of write yourself a little list of so you don't forget. That's where I think a list in prayer becomes helpful. But when it becomes like uh, Oh, I checked it all off, and then it's done. Then relationship got kind of somehow edged out of the process.
Well, and what happens then, it becomes old. It's like, uh, I love Lay potato chips, but if I
All
ate them,
right, we're talking about potato chips now.
but if I ate them day after day
Oh
after day
yeah,
after day after day, they would get old and stale. And I
yeah,
think
yeah, yeah.
sometimes when you get stuck in those lists, that's what happens. Is your prayer life becomes stale, and then all of a sudden it's old, and the next thing you're knowing is, why am I doing this?
You should just shift to Cheetos.
Cheeto prayers,
Yeah, well, they just don't get old.
but they also get cheesy all over you.
Cheesy is okay. Uh,
Leave it alone.
so you were talking about your list. What? So let's get into the nitty gritty. What? What do you say to God for like? So if somebody's listening and prayer is very new conceptually to them, or their relationship with God is new, and they're like what's the scope here? What do I talk to God about? Like, what should I wear to work today? I mean, where d- where do you engage with God, you personally?
Oh, there's a number of places. One I think is that I always feel like, and this changed some years ago, that I walk into the first part of prayer with adoration
Mm,
to have a really clear understanding of who I'm talking to. And so it may be things like acknowledging creation. You place the stars in the sky, and you called them by name. Only you could have done that. Um, the universe, the atom, whatever that might be in creation. It might be in the extravagance of his love or his patience or his kindness. So I might start off with something like that. Um, and then I'll go into, oftentimes, for me, my deepest prayer happens when uh, I I'm in scripture reading.
mm.
And so there will be points where I'll see something about a particular person and go, sometimes it's like, God, don't let me be like that guy. And other times it's like, God, I wish I had that heart that
Mm.
had, of this guy or this person or of this situation. Um, and then sometimes it's just like, I'm really joyful today, or I'm really sad today, or here's what's going on that was my concern. Um, a great example is this 2 weekends ago. Uh, my daughter and her husband and my granddaughter came to church, and they hadn't been to church for a long time. And the only reason they came was to hear me speak. But it was a deep prayer of mine that my children would come again to church, at least,
Mm.
you know. And so it was like God was answering that prayer, and that was a joyful prayer I had for him for the next several days. Was, oh, I just can't believe you
You
made this
worked it out.
happen.
Yeah,
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 and so there was a lot of joy in that prayer for the next several days.
yeah. I confessed earlier that my struggle sometimes is being too agenda driven. Um, and part of my way around that is sometimes I context is really important to me when I pray. So if I pray at home, like physically, if I'm in my home and like I'm up in the morning and I'm the only morning person in my home, so me and the dog are up, and if I'm praying at that time, I'm probably praying about home stuff. Uh, if I'm if I'm here at church and have an opportunity that have some space or time to pray, if I'm not in a meeting, um, um, then I'm often praying about church stuff. If it's around here, that kind of thing. If I'm out in the community, I'm far more likely to pray for lost people or for things going on in the world, um, when I'm out at Walmart or on a drive or something, and I'm seeing things that are prompting me. So I'm very contextually driven in prayer. Do you find yourself that way, or is yours more um, like the whatever the plan of the conversation is,
No, it's
or the
actually all over
intent?
the place. I mean, I intentionally spend some time in prayer in the morning, um, just praying about different things, whatever's on my mind that day. But I will pray multiple times, like you, throughout the day, depending on what's hitting me. And that goes back to what I said. There's not a right or wrong. some people say, well, I should be spending more time in prayer in the morning. We know that Jesus went out early in the morning to pray, but it doesn't say he just went out and stopped at that time. We see throughout scripture that he prayed multiple times throughout the day. And why do I have to limit my
Hmm.
time to a certain schedule in my day, or to a certain amount of time, when I can say, if I spend 10 minutes in the morning praying, but I stop and I pray for a staff meeting, or I stop and somebody says, would you pray for me? If I don't stop right then and pray for them, I'm most likely
Me
going
too.
to forget.
Yeah, me too.
So I've really learned to say, okay, let me pray for you right now.
All right.
But that often causes me to rethink about them later on, about, oh, I need to reiterate, or just ask God again about that prayer. So I think that for me, praying throughout the day is important.
Hmm.
Um, there was a pastor I heard that said he would sit down with a newspaper and he would read the paper, and that was his prayer time,
Mm.
because he would read the articles. Um, I love listening to you pray.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I think that your prayers are, like you said, they're contextual, but you have such a great command of words, and it's
Oh,
something
that's
that
funny.
you know I could never uh, pray the way you do, and I never would want to, because that's not me. But I love hearing you pray.
Oh, that's funny. You've never said that before. Um, I've actually heard people talk about liking the way you pray. Uh, I've never heard about me before. Uh, that's funny. Um, so it's conversational. There's sharing in prayer. There's asking
Mhm.
in prayer, and those things are all good. Sometimes, I think, as a whole in the modern world, we're probably a little anemic on listening in prayer because we don't do dead space very well. You know what I mean? Apparently not.
Oh, I was listening to you.
Jeez, Paul. Uh,
Excellent.
uh, um, but I just think, people like that,
We're
like
uncomfortable with silence.
yes. Oh, and the younger they are, the more uncomfortable they are. Um, and so I think that's definitely a place where I think many of us could grow by just pausing and listening and see where God takes our thoughts, see what He might be whispering to us. A lot of times, just listening for listening's sake is much harder than listening for something specific, like asking God a question, like, God, you know, can you help me with this decision about a job situation, and then you specifically stop and start just kind of thinking about that job situation and just kind of listen to see if God is directing you. Um, and that's hard to do because, again, it's not an audible voice. It's 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 not a neon sign. It's just trying to get a sense of what God's spirit is kind of bringing up in your spirit. That's a acquired skill, I think.
Well, and I think, at least for me, I remember having to move through the anxiousness of the quiet. Um, and what I mean by that is that when you stop and you just start listening, you're like, what am I listening for? You know, and when you are able to move through and go, okay, relax, just let whatever comes, and kind of move through that anticipation
Mm-hmm.
and that anxious, and you begin to just kind of relax into the silence. That's when things begin to happen. Um, but there's almost that tension of, when I ask God a question, what's his answer going to be? And then, like, if I ask you a question, you're very quick to say, here's my answer. Well, we kind of expect that with God too. And God doesn't always answer immediately like what we do.
Yeah, yeah,
And I think we struggle with that.
absolutely. All right, so it feels like it's time to mix it up a little bit and poke fun at ourselves a bit. And so I want to talk about the funny things that we do in prayer, um, particularly in church life. Um, and so I'll start with one of my favorites, and I had to be cautious. Let me say, for the sake of the podcast, not trying to mock people here, specific people here, as much as I am like, let's acknowledge that prayer is an unusual activity in the sense that we don't do this in any other way in our culture really that I can think of. Um, and because of the the strangeness of it, sometimes we get these little quirks that just we should be able to laugh. We should be able to laugh at ourselves about it. So one of the ones that I hear a lot is the repetitive use of God's name. Uh, and Scott, if we were having a conversation, Scott, and Scott, I said your name two or Scott 2 or 3 times, Scott, in a sentence like this, Scott, or maybe 10 times in a sentence, Scott, you would be like, this guy has really weird, Scott, conversation skills, Scott.
I would probably either think I just met you and you're trying to remember my name, or you've got some strange perseveration going on here. Perseveration.
Wow, that's a good one.
Yeah.
That's from your medical background, I think. But people use particularly the word Lord like that. Lord, we come to you, Lord, for this, Lord. And it's almost like it's a replacement for or just the something in the brain that just like needs to fill a space because it's uncomfortable.
Something that just crossed my mind though is that goes back to our very first conversation, is that when I'm looking at you eye to eye, you don't have to remember who you're talking to.
Oh, that's a good point.
But when that person is not responding, when, like we said, it's not, you just know that they're present, but you don't know. You're kind of like, it's almost like you're looking around the room. Okay, Lord, where are you at, Lord? What are we talking about, Lord?
So maybe in a positive way, it's a way of staying focused on what you're doing.
Maybe.
It's still weird.
Yeah.
And then in our church setting, and I hear it more than just at Stone Ridge, but definitely in our church setting, it used to be like when I was a kid growing up, you either prayed about something or for something. Like, I'm going to pray for you, or I'm going to pray about this situation. Like, that was the entire language of prayer, like when you were talking to someone. And for some reason now, we're going to pray into things. We're going to pray. And I guess maybe in the past we pray with someone. But we're going to pray into things. We're going to pray over things. And there were a few others like that are like the prepositions of prayer.
Let me lean into that.
Yes. Well, I'm going to really lean into that in prayer. And I just started laughing about all the new prayer prepositions, and like I want to keep using one time I teasingly was saying, I'm going to pray under that. And
did you get a strange luck?
They actually, I've done it like obviously joking before and then not so obviously joking before, and it's funny how easily it just slips in now because people are like, oh, I'm going to pray over it, I'm going to pray under it, and somebody's like, oh yeah, it's like, no,
I'm going to bathe it.
We do bathe things in prayer. Yeah. And now we're going to so I want to spiral things in prayer. I'm going to pray next to that.
Can I zigzag through it?
Yeah. So I feel like we're just looking for some new way to express, which again, not entirely bad, but sometimes it just
is humorous.
Sometimes it does.
The other one that sometimes cracks me up is that we try and speak to God in religious language and almost this idea of
King James version.
Yeah, almost. And thou wast Lordeth, that we bringeth forward to you, to ye this, and I'm like, can you get a translation on that?
We have a friend, Bart, our friend Bart, has this phrase he uses in prayer that you don't use really almost anywhere else, but he'll ask God to bring forth something. Yeah. And it cracks me up. I smile every time I'm in a setting where Bart's praying. And then it's almost in every prayer. He's going to hear this and then beat me up.
He's big enough to.
And it's not bad. It's just, it's like the only place nobody uses bring forth
Right. You don't hear it in
anymore.
common language.
Yeah, it's not common. And so it's,
Excuse me, waitress,
Mhm.
can you bring forth our meal?
Yeah. And it always sounds so inspirational in prayer. Like, bring forth your plan, Lord. It's like, yeah, like, charge, take the hill. Uh, um, oh, let's see another one. This one's kind of a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, and it's really almost a pastor's thing. I mean, I'm sure other people have done it, but it's a pastor's thing. Of, I don't know how many times I've heard a pastor finish their message. And honestly, I have caught myself from time to time trying to do it, and I try really hard not to, just because it's my own pet peeve. So I try not to lost the word.
Participate?
Sure, that one too. But there was
Violate?
another. I try not to perpetuate. That's what I
There
was
we
looking
go.
for. I try not to perpetuate this, but when a pastor finishes his sermon, he closes in prayer, and then obviously he's thought of something during his prayer that he forgot to include in his sermon, so he makes the prayer an extension of his sermon, rather than and it seems, at least it seems obvious to me times when it's like he's introducing new material that he didn't put in the original sermon, and it's as if it's designed to like get that one final point in. And I'm like, then are you really using a conversation with the creator of the universe to make one more point to this group of people over here? Or maybe if you have the attention of the creator of the universe, you should just focus on him.
So, Lord, I have one more point I want the congregation to hear, but I don't have a word that begins with a D to start with it. So,
Yeah. I'd almost have more respect for it if it was like that. Lord, I've got one more thing. So could you hold on a moment? And I'm going to say this. that would, that would be awesome. I would stand up and applaud. Um, so that's a pet peeve of mine. Do you have any prayer pet peeves?
you know, the one and I don't hear it a lot so much anymore, but I used to hear it was kind of the gossip prayer. You know, when they were praying for somebody, but they were really talking about them and the
Mhm.
situation that they were in. You know, like, uh, please convict Betty Joe about the adultery relationships she is in, and it's like,
Yeah.
nobody needs to know that.
Yeah, and everybody else in the prayer circle is like, "Oh, yes, Lord." Like, "Yes, tell me more."
Amen. Oh, really, Lord? I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
Oh,
You
really?
know?
I mean, sorry. Yes. Amen. Yeah, I think you're right. I hadn't thought about the fact that I haven't heard that done in a while, but I used to hear that done. That's a weird way to speak. I feel like I just
It sounded strange in your ear, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. I've heard that before, but not as much recently.
You know, I think the uh, not only our church, but the Big C church has really tried to get a good handle on gossip,
Hmm.
even in prayer. And so I think they've kind of said we need to stop that. I think that's been a good thing. Let me ask you a question, Tom. What I mean, because I think things are funny, but what distracts you in prayer?
Squirrels.
Squirrels, any kind or just imaginary?
Squirrel. What distracts me? Honestly, having my eyes closed for a long period of time, I find personally distracting. I think for some people, the the focus of not seeing anything, and I do something. I have to be a little cautious because I don't want to freak people out. But when I'm praying in a group, I tend to look at who's ever praying, and if I feel like I'm going to freak somebody out, I'll just look at their shoes, uh, so that at least, like, in my mind, it's a way to say that person's speaking. Pay attention to what they're saying, and then if somebody else prays, then I'll look at a different pair of shoes. Or if it's a more comfortable group, I just might have my head up, eyes open, looking around. I think I often will switch and either close my eyes if I start praying, or maybe just look down at the ground if I start praying. But for some reason, closing my eyes can lead to distraction, especially if it's too long. I'll start making shopping lists, or whatever in my head, or start thinking about a movie I want to go see, or whatever. But what about you? What distracts you in prayer?
I think it's more things that I hear.
Mm,
Like if, um, and I pray both with my eyes open and eyes closed, and I'm not sure I'm distracted as much that way. But like if somebody is praying and there's a certain turn of words that I go, oh, that's really cool. That
oh
is
yeah.
very neat. I like the way, and they've
Okay.
gone through,
Apparently, I'm distracted by everything. Is
three
that too?
sentences later, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, there, I got
What
to
did
get
he
back.
say?
Yeah. Or and nothing against, because I'm one of those people that'll, when somebody else is praying, I'll go, yeah, Lord, please, or would appreciate, whatever. But sometimes somebody will be saying something that's kind of out of my normal character of hearing people respond to
Mm-hmm.
somebody else praying, and I'm like, what are they saying? What's going on? What's happening over there? Especially if they're one of those people that have what I commonly hear now is a spiritual language, speaking in tongues.
Oh yeah.
Um, I I'll pick up a little bit on that, and then I'm kind of leaning into them more than I'm leaning into, because I'm like, wow, that's kind of interesting how that's going. So a lot of times sounds,
Mm.
if my dogs go off, I'll have a tendency, just a minute, Lord, I'll be right back,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was trying to think. There's different things that distract me when I'm praying by myself than things that distract me in a group. Like in a group, visual things don't distract me because I use visual things to stay focused. And if somebody's like walking by, I'm still looking at the person who's praying. But if I'm home, like in the morning, curled up on a couch with my dog, and then like the cat runs across the room and the dog perks up or something, then it without question totally derails, and more inclined, like I'll start to pray about something and it'll make me think of something else, and then
Hmm.
I'll chase that thought and then realize that, oh gosh, I'm not praying anymore, I'm thinking about something else. And I always aspire um I always aspire when I'm alone to pray out loud, and I almost never do. I feel like I would be far less distracted if I was praying out loud, but those times when I'm home and there are people around, like that just seems weird to pray out loud while they're around. And
Well, especially if they're not praying with you.
well, yeah, and I mean like they're in their rooms asleep, but then dad's out like mumbling in the living room. It seems weird.
Dad's lost it.
Yeah. So I don't often pray out loud. Sometimes I do if I'm like on a walk. I'll just kind of talk to God, and I might do that out loud. Um, but I always find that's a way around distraction for me
Yep.
is praying out loud.
The nice thing about being able to walk and pray now is everybody thinks you're talking on the phone. And so you can
Just put
walk
an
by
earbud in and then just pray.
and just pray, and nobody, I mean, unless you're again, speaking in the King James prayer, nobody's going to think anything about you, just
Right.
having a conversation. So
Yeah. That's a good
uh,
point. All right. So let's wrap up with this, something super practical for people who prayer is uh, maybe new or just not something that they're satisfied with. Let's do some tips on either getting started in a prayer life or sharpening your prayer life. Let's start with getting started. There's some obvious things that I think are boilerplate things. They're not hard and fast rules, but if you're really trying to start or refresh a prayer life, find a time and put it in your calendar, block it out so you don't plan anything else during that time. Often for many people have a place that is your go-to prayer place. It might be your back porch in the morning. It might be while you take your dog for a walk, or if you go on a run or whatever. So it doesn't necessarily mean a place like that's just one geographical point. It might be in your car while you're driving.
mhm.
That's a good time to pray with your eyes open.
Yeah, I would highly recommend that. It's interesting. I would say I've probably got two really um, consistent places I pray. One is I've got this little nook on my couch that that's my place. And
Hmm.
Shirley can come in, and she goes. Shirley's my wife, and she can go in and sit on. She sits on another couch, almost opposite of the room, but I don't have a problem closing my eyes and praying while she's in the room or anything like that. When life is normal, or life is kind of at a constant. But when I really feel like there is something heavy on my heart, there's something that I need to get out and talk, there is a ditch near our house that has a road by it, and I walk that and pray. Um,
You're gonna say I lay down in the ditch. It's like, wow, that's a serious prayer commitment right there.
well, it's really an irrigation canal, so I'd probably drown if I laid in it. But that's kind of my place that I go to say, okay, God,
Hmm.
I'm really struggling, and it's almost like Jesus knows. Okay, Scott's here. We've got something heavy going on, So
Yeah, and so I think, in addition to that, trying to choose a time or place that is mostly free of distractions is good, and that may even require telling the people around you that, like, if it's your family, like, hey, I'm gonna start having this, like, at 7 o'clock, I'm gonna have a prayer time. You know, please give me a little space until till I leave my office or come back in from the porch or whatever. Like, I really want to protect that time. It's good that the people around you that would support that are helping you not be distracted.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, there's another thing about just a consistent life of prayers and I like to call them breath prayers. I mean, there's a lot of different language for it, but essentially, it's those little prayers that you do, like when you're about to walk into a difficult conversation with someone. So it's literally like, the 3-second prayer. God, help me with this, or God, will you just calm my heart? And that's the whole prayer.
Hmm.
I think those constantly through the day give us that sense of relational connection, and I think cultivating that is one of the best things we can do in prayer.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think that takes for a little bit of discipline
Mm-hmm.
of thinking, okay, do I need to pray about this before I go in? Do I need to, you know, we assume, rightly so, that God is with us all day long, but sometimes it's nice to go, hey, going into this meeting, Lord, would you be with me and make it a good meeting? And that it could be as simple as that.
Absolutely.
Um, but I think that takes a little bit of discipline to acknowledge God is with us every step of the day. And that doesn't mean, you need to say, well, um, God, I'm getting ready to go to the bathroom, make everything go well. I don't know if that's necessary, but I think there are moments in our day when we can say, I'm going into a difficult conversation, or, sometimes even when I walk away from a conversation. Um, there have been many times I've driven away from church, just going, Lord, thank you. That was honestly a great service, and it was fun to meet you there.
Yeah.
And that may be all it is. Then I'll turn on the music and go on down the road. But sometimes it's just that quick.
Yeah, I agree. Um, and then we're gonna close. I mean, it'll be a long close, a little bit of a long close, but we're gonna close. This is kind of precious to me, um, and I think to a lot of people. Precious to me, I say, because I've used this in my own prayer life for a very, very long time. But Jesus gave us this template, if you will, for prayer, commonly referred to as the Lord's Prayer. But Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will. But you see, I went into King James language because that's how I learned it as a kid. But you know, that model for prayer, and I have used that model not every single day, but relatively consistently for about the last, I don't know, 15 years of my life. Um, and partly because it's a way for me to just structure my thoughts. And I'll have, you know, I think of them as kind of categories of areas to engage with God. And I'm certainly not, I don't feel limited by them, but I also feel like this is a way to make sure I'm covering, all the full potential of prayer for me. And so I broke it down into phrases. So, like, Our Father in heaven, that phrase to me. You mentioned it earlier. You start with adoration, um, and an acknowledgement of of who you're talking to, and the next part even goes a little deeper into adoration. But and I kind of like that the first word is our, not my. Um, that that is partly what drove the whole context prayers for me. Like when I say our Father and I'm at home, the nearest hour, not HOUR, but just OUR, um, the nearest hour is my family.
Right.
And when I'm at church, the nearest hour is church staff and church family. And so a lot of times that makes me think about like who am I who am I representing as I prayed this prayer?
Right.
Um, and then holy is your name. The second phrase is again that deeper place of adoration. Like I'm not just recognizing that it's God I'm talking to, but that there's something uniquely special about him.
Well, and I think it helps me to remember that whenever we say holy is your name, that idea of holiness is that separation. That holy
Mm-hmm.
means separate, a higher degree. And so for me, that gives me that sense of awe.
Right.
So
And you mentioned earlier sometimes the connection between what you're reading in scripture and your prayer life. And to me, this is another one of those places where it may that the what you're gonna talk to God about in this part of prayer, in the holy is your name part, is not just saying those words, but like, God, I just read about, I just read again about you creating the world and just the amazing creativity and power of just bringing something from nothing and
right.
something so complex and intricate and all of that. So, it may stem from what you're reading, this sense of amazement or appreciation of God. And that to me is the second part. And then your kingdom come, for me, like that's a surrender moment, really. It's about not, we all have our own agendas, but your kingdom come to me is saying, I'm going to lay down my agenda. Like I came to you with a laundry list, but right now I'm going to set the list aside and just say, whatever you want, I want to want that. So,
So let me go back to something that you said earlier and just have you apply that.
okay.
Um, Referring back to the email about, how, where does my faith come in when I'm praying that my relationship is restored and I'm not sure it's happening, so do I lose faith in God? How does that phrase, your kingdom come, your will be done, play into that?
For me, it's always about, not just I tend to want things that make my life easier. I think God tends to want things that make the world better. And so your kingdom come is me being willing to say, I'm willing to accept a role in making the world better. So in this case, like, what do I need to do? What humble step can I take to try to make this marriage a healthier, better place? So that would be how I would run with that. And then the kind of the companion phrase, the your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And when it talks about his will, I tend to think about I go into like actual behaviors. Like not only like God has an agenda for, if we go back to that marriage thing, I could make this marriage better. So your will be done. So I'm going to be gracious. I'm going to be humble. I'm going to be forgiving. Now I'm choosing actual things I'm going to do, not just a commitment to the cause, but what am I going to do in pursuit of that? Um, and I start thinking about my character and how I need to align myself with God. And I used to, I don't know, depends on the day whether on earth as it is in heaven is just part of your will be done or whether it's its own phrase. But I think we often get, I think, a little comfortable thinking that our our expectations for life here and now, we can keep those low because heaven's going to be so much better. And this to me is such a challenge of like, no, Lord, I want to be as loving right now as I'm going to be in your presence in heaven. Like, oh, what a great challenge. But I think the Lord's Prayer is actually quite demanding of us.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It puts you in this really humble space. And so then there's some asking in the Lord's Prayer. Give us our daily bread. Um, and I tend to focus on daily. Like, what are my needs right now? Like, what do I need in the moment? Not worrying about what's happened to me in the past or the far off future, but what do I need today? Well, how can I be, engaged today with God? Um, and that often prompts thankfulness when I recognize, there's so many people that would pray, give us our daily bread, and they literally mean it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and when I pray it, I already have it. Like I can go to my pantry and I got bread for days, uh, or food for weeks probably. Um, so that's a time I often kind of go into thankfulness. Forgive us as we forgive. Again, really challenging. Like that I would willingly on my own make ask for my forgiveness from God to be conditional on the way that I'm forgiving other people. I think that's
Well, and I think sometimes we forget that, um, and I love the way that, and I know it that it comes from the definition, but I love whenever you say confession is in agreement with God, that I agree with God.
mm-hmm.
And when you say, forgive me my sins or my trespasses, you're saying to God, here are the things I confess that I'm in agreement with you that I have done wrong, that you say this is the right way and I've taken it the wrong way. Um, and we're very quick to say, to brush stroke it and say, forgive me for all my sins.
Right.
Instead of stopping and going, God, um, it was really unfair of me to call that guy an idiot that cut me off in his car. I don't know that guy at all, you know. Um,
Really not sure how intelligent he is.
yeah,
Yeah.
I, you know, and at the time it was really easy to do it, but now looking back on it, it probably was not the right
Mm-hmm.
reaction. So forgive me for that, and sometimes I think we forget that it's important for us to recognize uh, those little details for us to really understand. Look how much God gives us in spite of all those things that we don't deserve,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, and there's a generosity with our forgiveness to other people that
Right.
this would prompt us toward,
Exactly.
which I think is huge.
Yep.
Don't lead us to temptation, but deliver us from evil. I tend to lump those together um, in my own head, but I also use that as an opportunity to name my temptations.
Mhm.
Like you can just say, "Don't lead me into temptation," but when you name your temptation, you kind of have to own it. Like oh hey, I'm tempted to to maybe minimize this problem, or I'm tempted to avoid this person, or I'm tempted to overindulge in this area of my life, and actually naming it and saying, God, I'm looking for a way out of these.
Well, and let's be honest, at least for me, when I say, don't lead me into temptation, as soon as I say it, I'm thinking about what those temptations are. So I might as well verbalize them.
Yeah.
I mean, I might as well always go ahead and say, don't let me do this, don't let me do that, because I'm already thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think sometimes God knows our hearts. He already knows that we wrestle with it, but when we won't actually name it out loud specifically, I think in our heads we're keeping it at a distance, where in reality I think what we're doing is keeping it in a closet. that God is aware of, but he's not going to force your closet door open unless you're willing to open it to him and shine his light into that dark place and begin to clean it out.
Right. I already know what's in the room. I'm just not going to talk to you about it until
Yeah.
you're ready to open the door.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So, and then I love the closing of the prayers. To me, is just it's like you start and end with recognizing and adoring God, and so yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory, because the only true power we have to see our lives be what we aspire for them to be is His power, and He has the right. I mean, it's the world He made. He has the right to do with it as He pleases, and He deserves the credit for what He's doing. And so it's kind of a return to remembering those deeply fundamental truths.
Right. And that nothing that happens today in my life is under my own power. I mean, I have the will and I have the strength and I have the ability and I have the talent and I have maybe the resources, but none of that comes to me naturally. It comes through the power of the Creator. And so everything that happens today, the glory and the praise goes back to where it originally came from.
Well, that's everything there is to say about prayer.
So, Tom, I appreciate, Tom, that you gave us this message, Tom, on how to pray, Tom.
Stop, please. Actually, there's so much more, and we'll do another episode on prayer, particularly the prayers that we say for other people, and the role that prayer has in the way we engage in the world. I think there's so much more to say, but this episode was all about really the way we engage with God. But then there's that extra step of engaging with God about the world around us, and I think there's more to say there. But
well, and I think that there may even be in a part of that conversation. Another conversation is, what do we do when we don't feel like they're being answered? What do we do when the conversation doesn't feel like it's going anywhere?
Right. Well, that's our episode for the day.
Y'all have a good day now. Excellent.
Excellent. We do hope that this will sharpen your thinking, that it will inspire faith-infused conversations about prayer or just other parts of your spiritual life. And we also hope that if we can be helpful to you, that you'll reach out to us. You can find a way to contact us on the Stone Ridge Church website, stoneridgechurch.com. And we'd love to further the conversation with you outside of this setting.
Sounds good to me.
All right.